Without a doubt, Final Fantasy is the definitive RPG experience. It's easily the most recognizable name in the genre, and one of the most prolific.
Final Fantasy fans are some of the most spirited and opinionated fans of any series out there, so I'm sure that this list will have its fair share of supporters and detractors. But we can't make everybody happy, so we're just gonna follow our hearts and choose our favorites in the series. You may be surprised to hear that there are currently 28 games under the Final Fantasy name, so there's definitely no shortage of games to choose from.
We are going to try to whittle that down to measly 5 choices. So without further ado, I'm Cameraman Joe.
And I'm Classman Jared. And here's our top 5 Final Fantasy games.
Number 5.
Final Fantasy X is definitely the strangest game on our list, and this is a list of Final Fantasy games which tend to be a little weird, especially in the later years. The series always tends to try to reinvent itself, and that's pretty apparent in Final Fantasy X. As a follow-up to 9, there are some major changes to the aesthetics. X is like the Wind Waker of Final Fantasy games, as it has a strong water-ocean theme going for it. As far as the later Final Fantasy games go, this is definitely the premier game of the bunch. Even Blitzball, the soccer-like sport that Tidus plays in the game, provides a nice break from your grinding and plundering. Each Final Fantasy game has a mini-game to occupy your extra time, kind of like Final Fantasy VIII's card game, but Blitzball is probably the most in-depth of them all. It's like having a fun and interesting sports game nestled deep within your engrossing RPG experience. Final Fantasy X was also the first game where instead of simply summoning a creature to fight for you, you're actually able to control the summon as one of your party members. The world map also went through some changes, the main one being that you don't have control of your airship, which is definitely a staple of the Final Fantasy series. Another drawback is that the characters and voice acting tend to get annoying quickly, but the story is strong and you still manage to form a meaningful bond with your party. Despite all its downfalls, the production value, graphics, and overall quality of the first Final Fantasy game on the PS2 made you forget the few shortcomings that it had, and it certainly deserves a spot on our list.
Number 4.
Square's first venture into the grid-based strategy genre, Final Fantasy Tactics brought the trademark fantasy allure of its more traditional RPGs to a new type of game. This genre was familiarized by popular franchises like XCOM and the like, and Square's first attempt was good enough to make our top 5 list. This game was very underappreciated when it came out, but as rumors spread through the underground, it became quite the commodity, and to this day it's pretty difficult to find for a good price. Of course, you're earning experience in this game per usual, but you can also level up skills with the deep job point systems or propositions. Some jobs send you to familiar places that you've seen in past Final Fantasy games like the Tower of Babel and the Castle Baron. The sound and visual effects of this game were very impressive for the time, especially for being on the PlayStation 1, and the summons and spells look and sound amazing. Tactics didn't really revolutionize the isometric strategy gameplay you're likely familiar with, but with a great story full of twists and turns, deeply satisfying tactical combat, and of course, memorable and moving music, it definitely makes a good case for being one of the best Final Fantasy games of all time.
Number 3.
Final Fantasy VII is easily the most remembered and celebrated of all the Final Fantasy games, as well as the best-selling title in the series. People went out and bought PlayStations for this game. It's one of the main reasons that the console had such a promising start. Final Fantasy VII introduced 3D modeling to the series, and this graphical upgrade made RPGers everywhere shit their pants. In retrospect, this game looks like a bunch of polygons hobbled together in front of a static background, but this stuff was seriously revolutionary at the time. The main reason this game is so loved is because of the incredibly epic and moving storyline, which of course contains one of, if not the most shocking moments in video game history. The whole Aerith Sephiroth thing. Spoiler alert, she dies. The soundtrack is amazing, which is of course one of the hallmarks of the Final Fantasy series. It almost goes without saying. This was the first Final Fantasy game that was really embraced by the Western world, and if this was the first Final Fantasy game you ever played, you'd probably consider it to be your favorite in the series. But we still have 2 spots left on our list. What could they be? Find out now!
Number 2.
Final Fantasy IV, or as I knew it before I even realized there were other Final Fantasy games that weren't released in America, Final Fantasy II was developed in about a year by a grand total of 14 people. Compare that to the 150 people that worked on Mass Effect 2 over a number of years. Released in 1991, this was the first game to introduce the active time battle system, meaning that each character has a different speed value that determines their turn. Not to sound redundant, but this game's score is incredible. So incredible that the song Theme of Love is taught to Japanese music students as a part of their regular curriculum. Surprising, given that Nobuo Uematsu is quoted as saying that the production of the score was excruciating and limited, and that many sleepless nights were spent purely on the soundtrack. The game itself is lauded for being one of the first games to use dramatic storytelling involving complex plots and identifiable characters. The story of betrayal and redemption was, and still, is quite moving, and you genuinely care for the characters you meet through your quest. Final Fantasy IV also has the honor of having 4 re-releases, 1 remake, and 1 sequel. Ironic considering people have been chomping at the bit for a Final Fantasy VII sequel for years, to no avail. But there is definitely no shortage of Final Fantasy IV releases. There are some changes in the remakes from the original SNES version, like currency changing from gold to gil, the spells changing from Bolt, Bolt 2, Bolt 3 to Thunder, Thundara, and Thundega, etc., but most of the game stays true to the original. Final Fantasy II is one of the premier RPGs for the Super Nintendo, as well as one of the greatest of all time. It's such a complete and satisfying game that I'm amazed that there's still just 1 spot on our list to fill. How is this not number 1?
Before we announce our number 1 game, we'd like to hand out an honorable mention to Final Fantasy IX. This game tried to bring Final Fantasy back to its roots, replacing the futuristic setting of 7 and 8 with a more classic Final Fantasy setting. Although it didn't make our list, it more than deserves a mention as one of the best Final Fantasy games of all time.
Number 1.
Final Fantasy III, or 6 as it's known in Japan, is in our opinion the best game in the series. Why, you ask? Well, allow me to retort. Final Fantasy VI offers the absolute most gripping story that the world had ever seen at the time, and this is no exaggeration. Just the intro itself with all those Mode 6 effects is the most epic thing ever on the SNES, and paired with the mind-blowingly evocative music by the great Uematsu, this game is not only incredibly fun to play, but it's also a complete emotional experience. I would imagine that most true fans of the Final Fantasy series would quote 3, 6 as their favorite of all the games. This game marks a change in the setting and feel of the series, as instead of a kind of traditional Middle Ages castles, knights, and wizards feel, there's a more early industrial steampunk setting and feel. The setting is dystopian and dark, which really adds to the weight of the story. If there's one thing that Final Fantasy did remarkably well in the early days, it was revolutionizing the genre and really the totality of video games. Each game on this list did something incredible and new that blew audiences away. The series as a whole did wonders for the art of storytelling in games, and nowhere is that more clearly exemplified than in Final Fantasy III.
Well, that just wraps it up for our top Final Fantasy games. I'm Cameraman Joe.
I'm Classy Man Jared, thanks for watching.